All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm John Phillips, and this is Pittsburgh Sports Tonight, live from my basement. No fancy restaurant with a backdrop, just me in my new home. I've been here about, 6 weeks now, enjoying things immensely here. I'm pretty sure everybody can hear me. Welcome to our show on this Tuesday evening. We are Pittsburgh Sports Tonight. John Phillips here for the next hour or so. Going to spend a couple minutes talking a little bit about the Steelers today, and then around 7:10 p.m., I'm excited to bring on John Ziegler, who is a TV, he's an analyst, if you will. He's a commentator. He's been in the radio business, television business for over three decades plus. He did morning radio in Los Angeles. He's worked in New York, Philadelphia, big markets. John is based out of Los Angeles, and I kind of discovered him. I don't know how he popped into my algorithm. I think I was surfing around looking at some college football stuff, and John is a very opinionated individual, and he was talking about college football, and I liked what he had to say, and he was very interactive. And then I read his pinned tweet. You can check him out on X. He is at, I believe it's Sigmund Freud. It is hold on here. It is Sigmund Freud, Freud. I read his pinned profile, his pin tweet, and it took me to this discussion about Jerry Sandusky and Joe Paterno, and I started reading it, and I started looking at the information. I'm like, what's this guy talking about? These guys are innocent. Joe Paterno got set up, and Jerry Sandusky isn't a pedophile. He was railroaded, and I started reading this. He put a book together, essentially. It's called "With the Benefit of Hindsight," and this guy during COVID did a ton of interviews with all the pertinent people that were involved in the Penn State scandal in 2011, and over 100 hours of interviews. He talked to a ton of people, and I was just blown away, because at that time in 2011, for those of you that don't know, I used to work at 93.7 The Fan. I spent 6 years at the station. The station opened up in March of 2010. I was hired on within the first week, and I spent 6 years working there with everybody. Anybody who's everybody at the Fan, I've spent time with. And in 2011, I was never full-time there, but they used me a lot. And in 2011, when this scandal broke, I went bonkers. Because anybody that knows me through the course of my career, and I've been doing sports in Pittsburgh for over 30 years off and on, back on again, and I went bananas. I sharpened up my Penn State poking stick, and I just went after Joe Paterno. I said, fire this guy immediately. He's clearly hidden. He's helped his best friend, his good buddy Jerry, stay employed, and hit a pedophile. And I did a bunch of shows on the CBS radio networks across the country, Houston, Los Angeles. I was on in Seattle. I was on in other markets, and I just went on the attack and just bludgeoned poor Joe and Jerry like a lot of people, and it was bloodlust. Not going to sit here and lie. It was personal, because I never had an affinity for Joe Paterno. I was never a fan, mostly because he helped to destroy one of the greatest college football rivalries of all time, Pitt versus Penn State. And I understand why. I get that, Joe wanted to form an Eastern Football Conference, and in the mid-'80s, the Pitt athletic department was not run by good people. They didn't have vision. They, of course, Joe wanted this desperately. And good morning, Michael. Hello. Thanks for watching us on Facebook. He got betrayed by Pitt. They went and joined the Big East, and then Penn State tried to join, and then Pitt blocked that, which forced Penn State to go to the Big Ten. And once that happened, Joe was done with Pitt. And I understood it, but I resented him for it. I resented Joe Paterno for that. I got a chance to talk to him briefly in 1998. I was working on Ardmore Boulevard doing evenings on AM 1250, and he was Dapper Dan Man of the Year that year in 1998. And I went down to the downtown Hilton. They used to hold the Dapper Dan every year at the Hilton downtown. My old boss, Bruce Kyden, rest his soul, longtime columnist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, did talk radio in Pittsburgh for 15 plus years. I was his producer for a year and a half, and I went to that event, and I got a chance to briefly talk to Joe. And once he found out who I was, he didn't want anything to say to me, so I resented him further for that. And I went on the attack. I was on the air doing updates when they took his statue down. I have that update somewhere saved on one of my zip drives somewhere. I was on the air doing updates on a Sunday morning when they tore that statue down. I tried to pull it because I just wanted to play it. I thought it might amuse John a little bit. He's backstage. I'm going to bring John Ziegler in here in about 2 seconds. The heck with the Steelers. I just want to talk about this subject. But that's my background with all of this. It was stunning to me to read this man's work that he did, and I contacted him, and I'm like, you've got me questioning myself, and I have this show that nobody watches. Would you come on and talk about it? He's like, yeah, sure. I'll give him a lot of credit where credit's due. John Ziegler joining us live from Los Angeles. Good, sir. I guess I should say good afternoon to you out in LA. How are you?
I'm all right. It's still sunny and very warm here in the Los Angeles area.
Say that it was the same here in Pittsburgh, but nonetheless, thank you so much for coming on board with me. Fascinating work. First off, I guess really before we start to get into the subject matter, I need to know why you dove into this, because I don't believe you didn't go to Penn State, right? I don't think you have any ties or anything of that nature to Penn State, correct? You're not a graduate of the university, right? You have no ties. Why during COVID did this subject matter fascinate you so much that you would put together such an extensive amount of work, and then it leads to this incredible bombshell of just like I really have been speechless about it all, and I haven't even consumed, a whole bunch of this. But what I have so far has made me question why I went on the attack like I did, like a bunch of hounds, if you will, bloodhounds. Please.
Well, I actually think both of our stories are interesting to understanding the reality of what did and did not happen here. Let me tell you my story. First of all, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, but I had no connection to the Penn State program. I went to school at Georgetown University. I was a Notre Dame football fan growing up as a kid. So I had respect for the Joe Paterno program, and I was rooting for them, I guess, when they won in 82 and 86, their national championship games, because Notre Dame was out of it. But I had no love for Penn State and no dog in this hunt. But I actually think that was key. This is important. There's so many unique elements of this. That was key to why I was able to figure out what really happened here. Because I have come to believe, and this has been a 14-year journey. This didn't end or begin during COVID. That's when we put together the With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast. I started this almost immediately after the story exploded back in November of 2011, where the Joe Paterno element of the story just never made any sense to me. The cover-up narrative made no sense. And I'm somebody who has spent a lot of time around football. I've coached high school football in 2 different states. I spent a year with a high school football team in Ohio and wrote a book about it. I covered football in college and at the pro level for a TV station in the Pittsburgh area and then in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. So I knew football culture very well. And the general narrative of what we were being told made no sense to me whatsoever. But had I been a Penn State fan, or had I been a Joe Paterno fan, there is no chance that I could have found the truth of this case. And the main reason that that's the reality of this, and this is important for people to understand, it's a big piece of this massive puzzle, is that because the Paterno family became deeply invested in Jerry Sandusky's guilt. Nobody who was a fan of Penn State or Joe Paterno wanted to be opposed to the Paterno family.
Right.
And so
Okay.
because I had no loyalty to Penn State or the Paterno family, it allowed me to finally, after basically 2 years of research and having interviewed Jerry Sandusky extensively in prison, not once, but twice, and going on the Today Show and doing major interviews with Matt Lauer, not once, but twice about this case. It took that much for me even to finally be able to open up my eyes and go, wait a minute, the reason why the cover-up narrative doesn't make any sense, which it absolutely never did, is because there was nothing to cover up. And the reason why there was nothing to cover up is that, as bizarre as it sounds to people that have not followed this story closely, Jerry Sandusky is not only innocent, it's not even close. It's not close. That's the most shocking part of this. Anybody who has taken, and I'm not the only one, there have been dozens of highly credible people who have taken a close look at this case and come to the exact, or virtually the exact same conclusion, that not only is Sandusky innocent, he's obviously clearly innocent. We lost our minds, and maybe you lost your mind in the middle of a moral panic. That's understandable. Moral panics have done this in societies since the beginning of humanity. I mean, we had the Salem witch trials among many. I believe the COVID panic was similar situation. We have panics where people lose their minds. Logic, facts, sensibility goes out the window, and we start to believe crazy things. And then we become invested. That's the dangerous part of a moral panic. You become invested in what you believed in at the beginning of the moral panic because you don't want to believe you were duped. And you don't want to, if you're a Penn State fan, this is why Penn State fans are generally the worst audience in the world for this story. It's not just their loyalty to Joe Paterno and their confusion over why the Paterno family so disagrees with me and has been basically treating me like a persona non grata for most of my time, ever since I started down the Jerry Sandusky is innocent trail on this story. People can't understand that. And so they become so invested in the idea they didn't get duped. They didn't react poorly in a moral panic. They didn't throw their 5 best people under the bus. They didn't give hundreds of millions of dollars to total frauds without any vetting. They didn't cause massive damage. They didn't create the circumstance where 4 innocent people, not just Jerry Sandusky, but 3 administrators, went to prison for something that didn't happen. So people become inherently and understandably deeply invested in the fairy tale. It is far easier to dupe somebody than to convince them that they have been duped. And that's been my challenge in the story. And one of the reasons why I was eager to do this interview is it seems as if you are willing, at least to some level, to acknowledge that you did exactly what I just described, that you were caught up in a moral panic and you came to erroneous conclusions, but you, thankfully, have finally had the moral courage to take a look at the facts, think about it with a clear head, and not be restricted by the idea that you don't want to have to be forced to admit that you were duped and that you were wrong. And it sounds like you're more than willing to do that because you have been open-minded about seeing this narrative from a completely different perspective, which is what the podcast With the Benefit of Hindsight is really all about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's a fear. It's a fear, right? To admit one, I was wrong. I mean, I was jaded, first of all, and I readily admit that. I did not like the man at all. And we can talk about his family and we can talk about all that other stuff. That's all well and good. But and I think that's just an overall problem we have with society today is people just don't want to look at something and go a little deeper on it and then realize, hey, I may have been wrong. And wow, look at what this person has has come up with. Look at this information that I didn't know. I wasn't aware. I wasn't an investigative reporter or put my hat on and dig for information. I just went on the attack. And, to have spent some time now over the last couple of weeks since we first connected about a week or so ago, just kind of messaging one another, just to kind of just go back over and to listen to some of your, like your Gary Schultz interview. Right. I mean, that was telling, and there's a bunch of different jumping points here that we can get into.
Before we get into the facts of the case, John,
yes.
Before we get into the facts of the case, I mentioned that your story is important here. Are you willing to acknowledge that being a Pittsburgh guy, and I don't even know, did you go to Pitt or did you?
No, so I grew up worshiping, Pitt in the early 80s. As a little kid, my mother would take me down. Yeah, no, I have no affiliation with the University of Pittsburgh, none.
Okay, but you were a Pitt fan.
I was a Pitt fan, absolutely.
Okay, and
yeah,
part of being a Pitt fan is to hate Penn State, especially in the Paterno era. Correct. Correct.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Right. You have a disdain for.
So will you acknowledge that you were part of a group of people, and I've seen this to this day. I see it almost all the time on social media. There are people in the Pittsburgh area, especially, who are even remotely connected to Pitt University, fans of University of Pittsburgh, who so loved this story. They so loved this narrative because it justified in their minds all those years of hatred towards Penn State and Paterno, the jealousy, the envy, Paterno being put up on a pedestal. See, he was not worthy of that pedestal. In fact, he was one of the worst coaches morally that there ever was. And you frauds at Penn State, you were wrong all along. And we were right to hate you. That is an incredibly powerful influence on human behavior. And granted, look, not everybody in the state of Pennsylvania is either a Pitt guy or a girl or a Penn State fan, but there's a significant portion of the population that is impacted by that divide. And that divide played a significant role in all this. It helped drive in the media, especially in the state of Pennsylvania and especially in Pittsburgh. It helped drive what was really a nuclear firestorm of a manic media reaction to this whole thing because it had an audience. There was a huge audience thirsting for this story to be true. Right. And that played a role. Do you not agree with that, John?
100%. You're absolutely right. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. And it did. It drove a lot of attention. Obviously, I mean, it was the hottest thing on the station for quite some time. And the story dragged out for, McQuarrie, his lawsuit against them was, I think, 2015 or 2016.
For at least 3 years. For at least 3 years. Yeah. This was a massive story.
Oh, yeah, huge.
Not just in the state of Pennsylvania, but nationally as well. And so I guess, I'll go in whatever direction you want me to go. But I'm curious, John, as to why you bought this narrative at the start and why you no longer buy it.
I wanted to believe that my hatred for Joe, it's a hard word, but my disdain for Joe drove it. That's it. And I thought he should have walked away from, the coaching game years prior. But, he saw what happened to Bear Bryant. He saw what happened to, what's his name at Ohio State. He hung around too long. And then Rudy Hayes, thank you. And those guys died. I think Gene Stallings was another one that might have actually happened to as well. I think Joe just hung around because he figured if I quit, I'm going to die. And sure enough, less than a year later, he was gone. But I'm sure there was other things involved. But it was my disdain for Joe and my want for him to go away, which drove it primarily.
And John, to your point, if Joe Paterno, and I agree with you about him not retiring, if Joe Paterno had retired even 1 year earlier, 1 year than what his intention was, because his intention was always to retire at the end of the 2011 season, just not under the circumstances as it turned out to be, which were catastrophically bad. If he had retired 1 year earlier, Jerry Sandusky is not in prison. Wow. I believe that with every fiber of my being, because if Joe Paterno is not there at the time when the story breaks, the media doesn't care. The media doesn't care because Joe Paterno was the entire focus of the media narrative. It was a nuclear bomb that went off. If Paterno is retired, no one gives a damn. ESPN certainly doesn't give a damn. People need to remember that week in November of 2011 was quite unique. Baseball had just ended. The NBA was in a strike, okay?
Right. That's right.
And so we have the natural lull of football season at the beginning of November. There is nothing going on. And then all of a sudden, like manna from media heaven, this Greek tragedy falls in the laps of ESPN, and they turn what should have been hey, this is a weird story involving Jerry Sandusky. I wonder if it's true. We should probably wait for a trial. That's what would have happened if there was no Joe Paterno angle, and it got turned into, holy crap, the great Joe Paterno is covered up for a child sex abuser for 30, 40 years, or at that time it was only supposed to be 10 or 15 years, but then it got extended for reasons I'm happy to explain later on in the narrative. And then, of course, ESPN was broadcasting the Penn State-Nebraska game that weekend. So they had they had all sorts of self-interest in hyping this entire story. The Nebraska game was a pressure point that caused the Penn State Board of Trustees, many of whom had wanted to get rid of Paterno for quite a while, to panic. Talk about a moral panic. They panicked at the idea of Paterno being on the sidelines or at the game against Nebraska on national television after all of this media coverage, and they fired him. Well, that was perceived as a guilty plea by Penn State University. It was a guilty plea on behalf of Paterno. It was a guilty plea on behalf of the administrators, and it was a guilty plea on behalf of Jerry Sandusky. And not one person that voted to fire Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier, the president of the university at that time, although he didn't think he was being fired, knew anything about the case against Jerry Sandusky, because everybody was in a moral panic. Everybody was distracted. The Joe Paterno aspect of this story was a massive distraction. And without Paterno, let's say he had retired a year earlier, people would have gone, gee, that's a weird story. I kind of remember Jerry Sandusky. Wasn't he the defensive coordinator from that 1986 national championship game against Miami where they had 5 interceptions? I mean, that's the most anybody would possibly remember about Jerry Sandusky. And then we would go, oh, okay, well, I'm curious how that turns out. And that would have, and by the way, this is something that I'm not even sure you're aware of, and most people have no clue about this. The initial media narrative, people have to remember, this story leaks on a Friday night before a weekend where Penn State is not playing. They have a bye before the Nebraska game, okay? Paterno has just become the winningest coach in the history of college football the week before. Then they have a week off, and the story breaks through a very suspect leak to Pulitzer Prize, then soon to be Pulitzer Prize winning fraud reporter Sarah Ganim, in my opinion. She just happens to be there on a Friday night in front of her computer when they accidentally put up the grand jury presentment. So over the weekend, the story breaks, it becomes national on a Saturday and a Sunday. And guess what, John? The national media didn't give a shit. And really? I think the prosecution was like, whoa, wait a minute. This was not part of our plan. We thought we were igniting a nuclear bomb here, and the nuclear bomb was important because the prosecution's entire philosophy, their entire strategy, we have documentation of this, their entire strategy was, well, you know what? We don't have really great accusers against Sandusky right now, but wait until we arrest him, and this story gets massive amounts of publicity, and we're going to see all sorts of much more credible accusers coming out of the woodwork, and our case is going to get much, much stronger. That was literally in the memos written by the detectives in this case, okay? So when the story breaks, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't a news story. It was a news story, but it was not anything close to nuclear over that weekend. It was not nuclear until that Monday afternoon when the head of the state police in Pennsylvania gets asked a question at a press conference and implies that Joe Paterno failed in his moral responsibility.
That moral, yes. I remember. Okay, yes, go ahead.
That
Yes,
was
sir.
when everything changes.
Yep, moral.
That was like lighting a match on a gallon or barrel of gasoline, whatever a metaphor you want to use. That set off the firestorm because it changed everything. It turned what was a Jerry Sandusky story that no one really gave a damn about. He's been retired for a decade. He was an assistant coach. Who cares? To a relevant, to this day, Joe Paterno story because he just became the winningest coach in the history of college football, and he's got his last home game this Saturday against Nebraska. And there's nothing else going on in the sports world. Those are all the ingredients of a moral panic. And then just to finish this portion before we get into the actual facts of the case and why I'm right and why Jerry Sandusky is totally innocent, talk about a moral panic. I don't even know if you remember this. This is so significant to understanding the level of moral panic. So they fire Paterno, and before that Nebraska game, they cancel, Penn State does, their pep rally for the Nebraska game. You remember what they do instead of a pep rally? No, I don't. They hold a campus-wide candlelight vigil for the accusers. They cancel the pep rally. They do a campus-wide, thousands of people holding candles for accusers they know nothing about. Nothing. Wow. And then the day of the game, and this has never happened in the history of college football or maybe sports, the day of the game, before the game starts, some of the players from Nebraska and some of the players from Penn State meet at midfield and say a prayer on national television for the same accusers they know nothing about. Now, if you're Jerry Sandusky, how the hell do you get a fair trial in that environment? It's utterly ridiculous.
Impossible.
And yet, not only did they go ahead with the trial, Jerry Sandusky had 0 continuances, which is unheard of. Unheard of in any case. Forget about a high-profile case. So he gets arrested in November. He gets convicted in May of the next year.
Yeah.
That's on 10 different accuser accounts, which is just ludicrous. Forget about whether or not he's guilty or not, which he's not. Just from the sake of due process at a remotely fair trial, that's absurd. That is, you cannot possibly have a trial in that kind of environment. But that's what happened, and that was all part of the perfect storm of the moral panic that caused the greatest injustice in the 21st century that I'm aware of, and it's not even close.
He's 81 years old. I did happen to look that up before the show. Has his attorney, have you spoken to anybody who represents him?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've
spoken to Jerry, I believe. Have you not?
Many times to his former attorney, Joe Amendola. I used to be, I think, somewhat friendly with Joe Amendola, but then that relationship turned for a very significant reason. His appeal attorney, Al Lindsay, who I've said publicly, I think is borderline retarded. I think he's an incredibly dumb person who also is an egomaniac, which is a terrible combination. I mean, if you're going to be an egomaniac, at least be smart. If you're going to be brain damaged, you better not be an egomaniac. I don't think that he is directly involved in the case anymore. I've spoken to the person who was hired to be his federal appeal attorney because I thought we had convinced Jerry Sandusky he had no chance of getting a fair appeal in the state of Pennsylvania, where all the judges are elected and where obviously the entire apparatus of the establishment is deeply, 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 literally invested in not being fair to him in an appeal, and that a federal appeal is the only chance he has. I thought I had convinced Jerry Sandusky of that, but then he wimped out and went back to state court because Jerry is a very naive person, and he is terrified that if he goes, first of all, he's naive in that he thinks that Pennsylvania will eventually be fair to him, which is ludicrous. I mean, this is the same guy. Jerry Sandusky is so naive and at times so dumb that when it came to jury selection, he purposely wanted people with connections to Penn State to be on his jury because he thought they knew who he was. Penn Staters, as I've already implied, were literally the worst people to put on your jury possible, because they had more of an incentive than anyone else to prove to the world that Penn State was not enabling child sex abuse, and that they were as anti-child sex abuse as anybody could possibly be, so much so that we're going to railroad this innocent guy and convict him of 45 counts for which there was absolutely no evidence of guilt. And so when you have that situation, I mean, it's a perfect storm of BS, and that's kind of how we ended up where we are. But in a federal court, I think Jerry would have a chance, because I think, and I've had people who are much more of an expert in federal law than I am tell me that a federal judge that had any clue would look at simply the Brady violations in this case. Forget about the lack of evidence and the evidence of innocence, just the technical violations by the prosecution. And they would say, what the hell was this? By the way, they might even look at just the timing of the trial and that we've already referenced, which is, having a trial so close to a moral panic and a media firestorm in the very community that was being accused of enabling your crime. I mean, the fact that there was not a change in location and Jerry was against the change in location is just utterly insane. But I am confident that a decent federal judge would be outraged by this, even if Jerry was guilty, but he's not. And so that outrage would be hopefully magnified. But Jerry is terrified that if he goes to federal court and loses, you can't go back to state court. And he wants something to be able to live for. He wants some semblance of hope. I think he's terrified if he goes to federal court and loses that he will be, helpless in prison with literally no chance of ever being exonerated. And I'm not sure. And I understand that would be an extremely difficult thing psychologically. And 81, I don't know if many people can handle it. I mean, he's handled everything remarkably well so far. By the way, it's important to point out, he's never self-harmed and he's never been harmed in prison, which, if you know anything, rare. If you know anything about the history of prominent child sex predators in prison, that is unheard of. He's the most famous pedophile in America. He has never been harmed in prison. And I've had people who have met him in prison, prisoners who have gotten out and contacted me and said the reason why Jerry Sandusky has never been harmed in prison is that everybody there knows he's innocent. And that doesn't prove it, but that to me is very compelling.
It does if you know prisoners. If you know people that have been to jail, you would know that is a very fair statement. Very pleased to be joined by John Ziegler. He is the host of the Death of Journalism podcast, opinionated guy. He's on X at Zygmunt Freud. I love your college football takes, but that's for another day. I don't know where to start here. I don't know if I want to talk about the fundamental corruption in our judicial system first.
Well, why don't we explain to people the heart of the case and why it's wrong?
That's fine. Fair. Okay.
I mean, because I'm sure people are wondering, well, okay, tell me some facts. Okay.
Okay.
And I'm sure that the part of the story that captivated your attention, as it did the vast majority of the public back in November 2011, was the so-called Mike McQueary story, right?
Yes.
And so when we were told that the grand jury presentment claimed that Jerry Sandusky had anally raped a 10-year-old boy in a Penn State shower, and that Mike McQueary, a then graduate assistant at Penn State, had witnessed this and then told Joe Paterno what he had seen, right? That's almost word for word what's in this grand jury presentment. And the media pretended that a grand jury presentment is somehow like the word of God taken down from Moses on tablets or something. A grand jury presentment is the prosecution's, dream about what they might be able to prove in court. It is in no way, shape, or form proven. Well, I believe I have proven that every single element of that primary allegation in the grand jury presentment was not just false. It was clearly false. There was no sexual assault in the shower. Mike McQueary didn't witness the sexual assault. He didn't act like he witnessed the sexual assault. He didn't tell Joe Paterno he witnessed the sexual assault. The entire story is completely different. And by the way, it should be pointed out that even the hanging jury at Jerry Sandusky's trial, acquitted him on the worst charge in the Mike McQueary allegation. And I naively, John, at the time thought when Jerry got convicted, by the way, during Jerry's trial, I'm still presuming he's guilty. I had not come to this revelation yet that he was innocent. I had some questions about it. I thought maybe it was exaggerated. Some of the parts of the grand jury presentment didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm always concerned about the moral panic element, but I was buying at that time Jerry must be guilty. I was most concerned about the cover-up and the Joe Paterno angle. And when Sandusky was acquitted on the worst Mike McQueary charge, I actually naively thought, well, at least Joe Paterno is going to be vindicated here, because even the jury didn't think that he was guilty of what it is that Joe Paterno allegedly had been told about and allegedly somehow covered up or enabled. And that turned out to be obliterated by the absolutely absurd Free Report, which we can get to momentarily if you'd like to. But back to the Mike McQueary situation. I've made a lot of mistakes in this case, but my biggest mistake that I made was going on the Today Show with Matt Lauer the first time in early 2013 after interviewing Jerry Sandusky in prison the first time for 3.5 hours and not trusting my instincts. After interviewing Sandusky the first time in prison, I was convinced psychologically that the prosecution had messed up the McQueary date not once, which they admitted to. I guarantee you 99% of even the media that covered this case doesn't understand that this is a cold, hard stone fact, that the date that was in that grand jury presentment that caused all the media firestorm, the prosecution was forced at trial to admit that was totally wrong. McQueary got the month, the date, and the year totally wrong. He originally claimed it was March 1st of 2002. That was totally wrong. Okay, that's not an opinion. That's not John Ziegler. You can look it up. There's all sorts of articles acknowledging this. And to be clear, John, when I first saw that, which would have been early of 2012, this is in the lead up to Jerry Sandusky's trial, the prosecution is forced to admit the McQueary date is wrong. I'm like, really? We're going to pin all of this on a witness whose story makes no sense because he left Jerry and this boy alone in the shower and didn't do anything to stop what he claims now is an anal rape. But we're going to pin all of this on a guy who got the date, the month, and the year totally wrong? Really? And that really got my spidey senses going. But when I interviewed Sandusky in prison, I became, even though I was presuming he was guilty at this time, I became completely psychologically and morally convinced that even the second date that the prosecution used at trial, which was February 9th of 2001, so almost 13 months prior to the original date, that was wrong too. Jerry Sandusky knew in his bones that was wrong, but his legal counsel was so bad, and Jerry was so naive, and his memory was so foggy because of, he's not sleeping. He's in prison. He's in solitary confinement at times. There's a lot of reasons why Jerry couldn't come up with the right date himself. But I knew, John, Jerry didn't believe in the second date. And I thought to myself, is it really possible the prosecution could screw up this date twice? I just didn't think that was possible. I'm a conservative. I'm generally everybody's guilty guy. I'm a generally believe in the prosecution kind of guy. By the way, this was a Republican administration that brought this case. Tom Corbett, the governor of Pennsylvania. So I'm not somebody that had any inclination to believe that this was an inherently corrupt or totally incompetent prosecution. And I didn't follow my instincts. And when I went on the Today Show the first time with Matt Lauer, I essentially had tabled this issue of, is it possible the prosecution got the second date totally wrong as well? And I made a massive error, because had I done even a decent job, I did a little bit of investigating, because I then also found out the identity of the boy in the shower. Once you learn the identity of the boy in the shower, the whole story completely collapses. But with regard to the date, had I done just a little bit of investigation, I would have known for sure that second date was also wrong in a catastrophic way that blows up Mike McQueary's entire story. Because here's why, John, this is as simple as I can put it. The only way you get to rape in the shower is if McQueary has urgency, right? He has to have urgency in his response, okay? The only thing that even came close to counting as urgency was the narrative. McQueary sees this on a Friday night. He decides it's too late to go see Paterno. So he sees Paterno first thing in the morning on that Saturday, right? That was the whole essence of the urgency. Now, I would argue in a rational world, that's not urgency if you really saw a kid getting raped in the shower. But okay, I'm willing to be open-minded. I'm being very reasonable here. I'm willing to say that that is the lowest level of urgency threshold required in this case. And the prosecution, I think, knew this. I think they knew it was vital that they connect McQueary Friday night. He's got to see Paterno. Why he's not going to the police, they'll never really explain to us. But he's got to see Paterno first thing the next morning. Well, John, I believe I have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that that's not how this happened. That Mike McQueary waited 6 weeks before he went to go see Joe Paterno, and that his primary motivation for going to see Joe Paterno was not having witnessed some sort of a sexual assault in the Penn State shower. It was because on that morning of February 9th, 2001, he saw in the newspaper that Kenny Jackson had left the Penn State coaching staff to take a job with the Pittsburgh Steelers, something I'm sure you remember well, and that the wide receivers coaching position, a position that Mike McQueary desperately wanted as a lowly graduate assistant, was now wide open. And that's why he went to go see Joe Paterno that next morning. You know, the prosecution was very, very proud of the idea that they finally got some corroboration for one of their dates. I mean, this is kind of ridiculous. In a story like this, you would think dates would be everything. They only had one date. They only had one date for one of these allegations, and they got it totally wrong. So when they changed the date, they were very proud of something, John. I don't know if you remember this, but I as a football guy, you might remember this. They were very proud, the prosecution was, and the media ate this up. They were very proud that they were able to somehow connect that Mike had told them that he was watching the movie Rudy on television the night that this episode occurred. And the prosecution was very proud that they were able to find, because back in the olden days, this is the early 2000s, right? Back in the olden days, remember when the TV schedule was in the newspaper?
Yeah, right.
Right. So they were able to find that on the day of February 9th, in the TV grid, the movie Rudy was playing. I believe it was starting at 8:30 that night on either TBS or TNT. I always mix those two up, but it's on the grid, okay? And the prosecution was very proud because this finally corroborated something that Mike had said. My God, by the way, we don't have a phone record. People, never made this connection. Mike's story is that he called his dad immediately after witnessing this event. Why is it there's never been any phone record of that? It's on a cell phone. This is 2001, right? There should be a phone record of this that was never presented at trial. You know why it wasn't presented at trial, John? Because there is no record of Mike McQueary calling his dad on that date. He might have called him at another date, but it wasn't a date that was good for the prosecution. So we never got a phone record presented at trial. But here's where things get kind of funny to me, because all right, I thought a lot about this Rudy situation. My first concern about Rudy was, if you've ever watched the movie Rudy, you know that it's not really even a football movie till the end. Right? And Mike's story is he got inspired. He got inspired by the movie Rudy to go over to the Lash building, and that's when he stumbled upon Jerry Sandusky sexually assaulting a boy, which, okay, whatever, fine, that's your story. Well, here's the problem. This event, by Mike's own testimony and what Jerry says dovetails with this event happened somewhere in the 9 o'clock hour in the Lash building. Well, the movie's barely begun at that time. How do you get inspired by the first 30 minutes of Rudy? You don't. The inspiration part's at the end. Well, I now believe that Mike told the truth about watching Rudy that night. Mike watched the whole movie. Mike decided at the end of that movie, he was Rudy, and he was going to go see Joe Paterno the next morning to get that Kenny Jackson wide receivers coaching position. That's how Rudy played a role in all this. Not because he got inspired to go over to the Lash building. He had gone over to the Lash building on what I believe was December 29th of the year 2000, 6 weeks earlier, which dovetails far better with Mike's own testimony that this was an incredibly quiet night on campus. February 9th of 2001 was one of the busiest nights on campus the entire winter. There was a sold-out rock concert going on directly across the street. There was a hockey game going on in the Lash building itself. According to Gary Schultz, Mike couldn't have even found parking that night at the Lash building. To call it a quiet night is absurd. However, December 29th, 2000, in between Christmas and New Year's, that's as quiet as you're going to get on a campus. That fits perfectly. By the way, it also fits exactly with Jerry's memory of what else was going on at that time, which was specifically his book being released and him being a finalist and presumed to be getting the head coaching job at the University of Virginia. And we have documented all of this. I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg on this date issue. And by the way, even the testimony of Mike McQuarrie's own dad and Mike McQuarrie's dad's boss or his friend, Dr. Dranoff, who Mike allegedly told about this, by the way, 3 times denying that he had ever witnessed a sex act that Dranoff, who was a mandated reporter, asked him about. That their own testimony, Dranoff and McQuarrie's dad's own testimony, is totally consistent with my timeline because they think that there was 2 or 3 months from the time that Mike told them this to the time that they had a meeting with Gary Schultz. Well, with Gary Schultz's help, I've been able to figure out that meeting was only at most 2 weeks after McQuarrie went to go see Joe Paterno. Effectively, Mike waited. Now, why Mike waited? I have a bunch of theories as to why Mike waited. I think the Kenny Jackson job was the catalyst for why he went to go see Joe Paterno. But I believe that what really happened here is that I used the Loch Ness Monster analogy. On December 29th of 2000, Mike McQuarrie is at the Loch Ness. He doesn't even know any stories about the Loch Ness Monster. He's just looking around and he sees some ripples in the water and maybe a head poking out of the water. And he thought it was weird. And he told some people about it, and including his dad and this Dr. Dranoff. And now if we use this analogy, we now wait 10 years. 10 years later, investigators are desperate for a witness to try to back up this number one accuser against Jerry Sandusky, a guy by the name of Aaron Fisher, who was highly uncredible. No one believed him. He couldn't testify in court. He failed twice in the grand jury. He had all sorts of credibility problems. He had made similar allegations against another teacher at the school who had gotten fired, his track coach, a guy by the name of Tommy Hunter. So no one's believing Aaron Fisher. They need a witness. And so they find out through this bizarre series of circumstances that I believe was set off by Aaron Fisher's mom, who saw money and was desperate for prosecutors to be able to bring charges against Jerry Sandusky. So they find out about this situation where Mike McQuarrie had witnessed Jerry in a shower with a boy. That's literally what the email tip to the prosecutors said. You might want to talk to Mike McQuarrie. He may have seen Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a boy, period. That's it. And so they interview McQuarrie. By the way, McQuarrie panics when prosecutors contact him. We have an audio that's absolutely mind-blowing of this with ESPN reporter Don Van Natta, which you can find for yourself on YouTube, where Van Natta fully acknowledges that when he was doing a profile on Mike McQuarrie, he was going to report the following, that McQuarrie, when he gets contacted by investigators, his wife calls him and tells him investigators want to, by the way, his now former wife, calls him and tells him that they want to speak to him. Mike panics. He doesn't think this is about Sandusky from 10 years ago in a non-event. He thinks it's because he has been sending pictures of his penis through a Penn State phone to a woman not his wife. By the way, again, now no longer his wife because they've been long divorced after this whole story blew apart. Well, Van Natta, I believe, was instructed by ESPN to kill that part of the story because that's too damaging to McQuarrie's credibility. ESPN had become far too invested in McQuarrie's story. And then when the story, finally, the profile of McQuarrie did come out, it was nowhere to be seen. I have the audio proving that Van Natta had all the goods on this, and he told me point blank, I'm going to report all this. Again, you can find it for yourself on YouTube. And so what I think happened is that when investigators finally do talk to Mike, and he's thrilled that they're not talking to him about the penis pictures. They're not talking about him about his gambling problem, which he clearly had at Penn State. There's a video on YouTube of him absolutely, I don't know if you want to call it fixing or, he threw a touchdown pass against Rutgers in the last seconds of a game that caused a fight between Joe Paterno and the head coach at Rutgers that was clearly essentially point shaving because Penn State was running out the clock. And Paterno, I think, intended to run out the clock. McQueary threw like a 45-yard touchdown pass on the last play, and Penn State covered the spread. So McQueary has got a huge gambling problem. He's got a penis picture problem, and he is thrilled that these investigators are not talking to him about any of that. So going back to the Loch Ness Monster situation, they convince him, hey, Mike, we heard you had a visit to the Loch Ness 10 years ago. We need to tell you that there's a horrendous monster in there, and we've been trying to catch this monster, and this monster is harming innocent children, and we need you to help us catch this monster. Can you help us? And now all of a sudden, Mike looks at that story from 10 years earlier at the Loch Ness with a completely different set of eyeglasses, right? He's seeing it through a completely different prism, and especially 10 years later. So what was, to mix metaphors, what was a one alarm fire in 2001 suddenly becomes at least a 3 or 4 alarm fire for McQueary, especially when he's very eager to give investigators what they want. And then investigators, desperate, write in the grand jury presentment this story as if it's a 5 alarm fire. So we go from a 1 alarm fire in reality, at the lock, where Mike's just seeing ripples in the water and someone poking their head out, to all of a sudden, the Loch Ness Monster is eating children, and Mike is witnessing the whole thing. And I believe that's what's happened. And I think that the date is the key to understanding that. And our first episode of the With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast is called The Date, because I think once you understand the date, you understand how this entire story collapses, because without McQueary's eyewitness or alleged eyewitness, actually ear witness, he testified more to what he heard than what he saw. Without his ear witness testimony, this case is a house of cards. The whole thing collapses. And I was stupid, and I just made a huge mistake. And I'd gone on the Today Show the first time with Matt Lauer, and that had been my focus, explaining to people that we have the second date wrong and that it blows Mike McQueary's credibility apart. I think I could have made a dent in this story and in this narrative. I blew it. And unfortunately, I've done everything I possibly can in the decades since then to try to repair that, but I don't think it's repairable because of this perfect storm of circumstances.
John Ziegler, our guest here on Pittsburgh Sports Tonight, been in the media for over 30 years. He's the host of the Death of Journalism podcast. You can check out the work at framingpaterno.com, an entire website that is just a body of work that John put together, reconstructing the Jerry Sandusky, Joe Paterno saga from 2011. It's really compelling stuff. Getting a comment on YouTube saying it's amazing that this stuff is still resurfacing this many years later. And and as I said to the individual, that so many people are reevaluating this. When you have facts, when you have this much evidence, okay, and again, I've only scratched the surface. I'm embarrassed that I can't consume all of this and be as prepared to speak to you. You've obviously spent quite a bit of time, a lot of time immersed in this, and your ability to recall things is tremendous, and it's greatly appreciated, because I'm learning again. I'm relearning. I'm trying to unlearn what I once knew. Right. And that's, I think, critical. It just is a growth of a human being. If there's an individual that's sitting in jail, and again, to go back to the corrupt prosecution, the way our criminal justice system is as it is I think we know that there's 2 tiers out there. There's probably more tiers than that, to be quite honest with you. It kind of fitting that Mike McQueary, I tried to do a dive on him. I tried to find, I couldn't find any news. The last piece of news I saw on him was in 2019. He got scapegoated from what I was reading, I did a little bit of research on some of it. I guess the prosecution kind of turned on him, and his life became complete hell. And who knows if he's still living at home with his parents or not? But I have no idea where the guy is. Where is he? Do you know?
Well, he made a hell of a lot of money from this case.
He did over $7 million
because he had this ridiculous whistleblower lawsuit against Penn State. He is not a whistleblower by any standard definition of whistleblower, but I think this shows you how deep the moral panic went and how deeply invested Penn State was in pleading guilty to things that didn't actually happen, and how how easily manipulated the court system was, because everyone just bought into this whole narrative, and somehow McQueary becomes the good guy or the hero in this story. He's not there's no scenario where he's the hero. If I believe he made a false testimony, but if he somehow testified properly, he's the one that left a 10-year-old boy. It wasn't a 10-year-old boy. It was a 13-year-old boy alone in a shower with someone who he believed was raping him. I mean, despite the fact that he's 6'4", 235 pounds. I mean, it's absurd that Mike McQueary somehow was a hero in this and made a lot of money. But, I'm a big believer, John, that in a lot of stories, you can find out what really happened years later, like after a presidential election. I think you learn a lot. After a court case, you learn a lot. After a divorce, you learn a lot, because people let out the truth, and you see how they've reacted in the aftermath of what has happened. Like, for instance, O.J. Simpson's the perfect example. Everyone knew O.J. was guilty, but when he spent the rest of his life on the golf course until he went to prison in Las Vegas, instead of trying to find the real killer, you knew he was guilty, right? So using that premise, let's take a quick look at what's happened since this story. So Jerry Sandusky is still appealing, which is unheard of for a pedophile. Unheard of. I mean, pedophiles don't appeal. They plea bargain, which Jerry never did. It's unheard of. I've never heard of a case like this where all these years later, on a substantive basis, a so-called serial pedophile is still appealing. He's not only just still appealing, he's still married to Dottie Sandusky. Now, look, is it possible to believe that Jerry has just somehow duped Dottie, and that Dottie has decided that her life is better still living in State College, where my God, if Jerry was guilty, Dottie would have at least moved. If there was any consciousness of guilt, why would you still live in State College in their same house where the vast majority of the public hates your guts? The only reason why you stay is because you have no consciousness of guilt. And you certainly don't believe Jerry is guilty because you haven't divorced him. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, that's just the beginning. So Jerry's still appealing. Dottie's still married to him. Graham Spanier hasn't been divorced by his wife. Gary Schultz hasn't been divorced by his wife. Tim Curley hasn't been divorced by his wife. John Ziegler hasn't been divorced by his wife yet, although that's, could happen at any moment if you ask her. And yet, let's take a look at the other side. I would argue that it's impossible for none of those divorces to have occurred if I'm wrong, right? If I'm wrong, somebody would have gotten divorced. Somebody's spouse would have said, I've had enough of this. You were guilty. I'm out of here, especially since your name is now disgraced. Well, let's take a look at the other side. Aaron Fisher, victim number one in the Jerry Sandusky case. He's been divorced. His wife divorced him. By the way, I've interviewed his ex-wife, and I believe that she provides evidence that he was never abused by Jerry Sandusky, that he was in fact abused by his stepdad, a guy by the name of Eric Daniels, who was convicted of 100 counts of child molestation. I think that's the key to this whole case. I believe that Aaron projected the real abuse he suffered from his stepdad and put it on to Jerry Sandusky with the urging of his mother, who was driving the bus on this. By the way, speaking of divorce, you know who else has been divorced? Aaron's mother, also divorced in the aftermath of all this. You know who else is divorced? Mike McQueary is divorced. So all the so-called heroes of this case, HBO did a movie where Aaron Fisher's mom and Aaron Fisher are the heroes, a movie with Al Pacino playing Joe Paterno. They're both divorced. Mike McQueary is divorced, and Jerry is still appealing, and there's nobody I just mentioned divorced. Now, does that prove that I'm right? No, but it's inconsistent with my theory being wrong, because it should be the opposite. And these are just a few of the examples that I could bring you with where things have not turned out the way they should have if this narrative was true. There's all sorts. We could talk for another half hour about all the things that should have happened. By the way, the prosecutor in this case, Frank Fina, lost his law license because of his actions in this case. The grand jury judge lost his job because of his actions in this case. The Aaron Fisher's therapist lost his state contract because of his actions in this case. I mean, there's all sorts of things that have happened that the media doesn't tell you about because it doesn't. Those data points don't fit with the narrative that they accepted hook, line, and sinker back in November of 2011 and have never revisited.
This university, the current people that are in charge right now, I think you and I talked a little bit. I've seen you talk about it on X before. Terry Smith didn't get the head coaching job. He wore the Joe pin that said Joe 409. They want to distance themselves from this information, do they not? They want nothing to do with this.
One of the many key things that people have to understand about this case is that all the incentive structures are upside down. People don't understand that if I'm, I get this all the time. John, if you're right, why doesn't the Paterno family support you? Why does Penn State University not support you? They're very good reasons for that. Because if I'm right, and I am, Penn State University would be the laughingstock of the world because they pled guilty on behalf of not just Jerry Sandusky, but Joe Paterno, the person with whom their entire university is branded still to this day. Their highly respected university president, Grant Spanier, Gary Schultz, Tim Curley, both of whom were highly respected. They pled guilty on behalf of 5 people who were innocent, and they gave over $100 million to total frauds, and they paid a massive fine to the NCAA for things that did not happen. Now, what university, anyone who's still alive that took part in that is going to want to go through that, especially if they even made a millimeter move in that direction, they would be crucified all over again by the same media that's just as invested in the original narrative as Penn State University is. And by the way, Grant Spanier wrote a book, and when he did one of his book signings, it was broadcast live on C-SPAN, and someone asked him a question. I don't remember the nature of the question, but in the answer, Graham reveals that the counsel for Penn State University, this is recent, listened to the entire 4-hour interview that I did with Graham for the With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast, and based upon that, told Graham Spanier that they had concluded he had done nothing wrong. Now, this was a private conversation, but Graham revealed it publicly on his book tour. So there are elements of the university, and I think Terry Smith probably is one of those people, because you don't wear the 409 Joe button on national television when you're the head coach of the football team if you really believe any of this narrative. But there are people within Penn State that know, or at least deeply suspect, what the truth is, but they have no incentive, zero. They have a disincentive to even remotely pursue that path. And that's really important for people to understand. Similarly, with regard to the Paterno family, Scott Paterno, who's an obese loser who was acting as Joe's lawyer and advisor in this crisis, which was a massive mistake because Scott's an idiot. Scott's entire strategy was based upon the premise that Mike McQueary was telling the truth. Jerry is guilty, and that the only way for Joe to survive this is to throw Jerry Sandusky as far under the bus as possible. Well, and by the way, Scott had never had a conversation with Jerry Sandusky in his life. He didn't know Jerry Sandusky from Jerry Glanville when it came to former football coaches. I'm being sincere about that. And so Scott makes this strategic decision, which, by the way, in a normal case might have worked. I've said that many times. It might have worked to throw Jerry under the bus. But when you threw Jerry under the bus, you ended an enormous defense mechanism, because for Joe to be guilty, Jerry has to be guilty first. Well, they ceded that Jerry was guilty in 5 minutes because they were trying to create a political gambit to try to survive, stupidly, in my opinion, this initial media firestorm. And so Scott Paterno was praised for that, John. It's in the Poznansky book about, I think, titled Paterno, where Scott, for the first time in his life, he's a loser. That for the first time in his life, he's actually important. For the first time in his life, he's being praised publicly. People are chanting his name as he's asking people to say a prayer for the victims of the Paterno family home the night before Joe Paterno was fired. He's never experienced anything like this. If it turns out he was wrong, catastrophically wrong, then his entire life is a disaster. So he's never going to accept reality unless absolutely forced to. And, Sue Paterno and Jay Paterno have different but similar perverse self-interest structures that have caused them to not come out in favor of the truth. Although I have a feeling that I know Jay Paterno knows Jerry is innocent. I've had conversations alone with him in his living room. I know this. He's just a coward. I think Sue has suspicions about whether or not Jerry is innocent, but she's just been too brainwashed and she's too old and too tired to ever do anything about it.
Yeah, shame on Jay. I mean, look, I'm not in that hot seat, but if you believe that to be the case, if you believe he feels that he's innocent, shame on him. Quite frankly, I mean,
I agree. I think Jay is one of the biggest disappointments in this entire story to me, because I think Jay is very smart, and by the way, I should point out, Jay was the first credible person in this entire story to make me think Jerry might be innocent.
Wow.
How upside down is that?
It very without a doubt. You mentioned Graham Spanier. He wrote a book in the Lion's Den that got a lot of attention. Obviously, can you talk a little bit about him and what happened with him and Tom Corbett and how that power play all unfolded? If you don't mind, I think that's probably something that's important to cover here. And by the way, I want to go a little bit longer with you, if that's okay with you. I want to spend a little bit more time with you than I would normally. But I
have a few more minutes before dinner.
That's fine. That's fine. If you could real quickly with the Spanier and Corbett thing, if you're willing.
Yeah, it's an important part of the perfect storm here.
Okay.
Because part of people say all the time, well, what motivated the Attorney General's office to go guns a-blazing on this story? Why were they trying to set up Sandusky? I'm an anti-conspiracy person. I don't believe in a conspiracy. I believe in, if you will, a conspiracy of self-interest where people think that this is good for them. And you have to remember that all this happens right after the Catholic Church scandal has been a huge story in Pennsylvania, right? And so for a lot of people, especially the prosecutors, I think they're looking at this story and I think they're sincerely thinking, oh, we've seen this movie before. Paterno is the Pope, the administrators of the Catholic bishops, with a cover-up. Sandusky's the pedophile priest. The Penn State football fans are the parishioners, the Catholic parishioners looking the other way to protect their sacred institution. None of that is true, but that's an understandable perception. And I think the prosecution had that. And I think they also thought that this would be, really good for them individually because this was going to be a high-profile case. But Corbett had a particular incentive to nail Penn State on this because Corbett and Spanier were involved in a really very brutal and high-profile battle over education funding in the state of Pennsylvania. And Corbett's a Republican. Spanier's a very liberal Democrat. And I think Corbett saw this opportunity. The old phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. Right. I think he saw this as an opportunity to take out Spanier. If we can destroy Spanier's credibility and get him caught up in a scandal that he had absolutely positively nothing to do with, even if it was real. Spanier never even had a conversation with Sandusky or McQueary. It's just completely ridiculous that he went to prison for this whole deal, even if it was true, and it's not. But I think Corbett saw an opportunity to smear and take out Spanier. And John Surma, head of U.S. Steel at the time, who was the vice chairman of the Penn State Board of Trustees, had been asking Spanier for years, when are we getting rid of Joe Paterno? Because he and his brother had a vendetta against Paterno because they perceived that Paterno had mistreated Surma's nephew which is a whole complicated story that I don't think Paterno had any culpability in. But this is what happens when you're at a university, as long as Joe Paterno was in a position of power, you're going to piss some people off.
Yeah, right.
And he had pissed off the Surma family, and Surma wanted Paterno gone for a long time, and Corbett wanted Spanier gone. And it's clear as day that Corbett and Surma forged an alliance to get what they wanted. And they used the Sandusky crisis to get Paterno and to get Spanier. And that was a huge part of the perfect storm here.
John Ziegler, highly opinionated commentator, the host of the Death of Journalism podcast. You should check out his website, Framing Paterno, and the With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast. Just a mountain of information that really will make you think differently about the Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky story that goes back to 2011. Mr. Ziegler, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for coming on. Just incredible stuff, and I really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you, sir.
And thank you for having the courage to revisit this and acknowledge that you were wrong. One down, and probably
many more to go.
More media members to go. So I very much appreciate that.
I'm going to cut this up and get it out there. We'll get it viral, sir. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Take care, John.
All right, John Ziegler, ladies and gentlemen, just a fabulous follow on X. Sigmund Freud. His college football takes are amazing. I absolutely love it. His takes in general on the media. I'm a little bit younger than him. I just turned 56. We'll hang out for a few more minutes before we wrap up the show. Went a little bit long with John, but he was just fantastic. Did an hour with him. It felt like minutes because when you have good guests, and that's what I'm driving here. I want to do these shows, much like our Steel City Sunday show. We want to have good guests every single show. That's what drives, I think, people to want to, listen to a program of this nature. Do you have good topics? More importantly, how are your guests? And that guy right there, this is in the height of COVID that he kind of put all this together. Right. And go back 4 or 5 years ago and think about how crazy the world is. Here's this guy doing this massive deep dive into a very taboo subject. Right. Pedophiles are hated, as they should be. And here it turns out there's a good possibility, at least from the evidence that I'm seeing, that Jerry Sandusky is not a pedophile. And he's sitting in a jail cell right now and paying a price because people decided they wanted to take advantage of a situation that financially benefited them. And, look, terrible story. Really, to sit here and, to think that 14 years ago, I was going on radio stations in different markets of the country and just, rallying the battle cry of fire Paterno and get Sandusky. And then I come across John Ziegler a couple weeks ago, and my complete narrative on everything has completely changed. But again, a lot of people are unwilling to bend from this type of story because, geez, I was wrong about this individual, right? And let's be honest, our judicial system is corrupt. Prosecutors are corrupt. They want convictions. That's their job. Convict people, no matter the cost, right? That's really at the heart of this. If you're a Penn State person and you're not looking at this in an objective manner, shame on you. Shame on you. All right, that's going to wrap up our show. I'll be back again Monday next week, 7 o'clock, Monday and Tuesday. I'm working on a professional wrestler for next Tuesday's show. And all I'm going to say is if I can get this interview, I am going to mark out for an entire hour. I don't want to spill the beans on what I'm working on, but he is easily one of my favorite wrestlers from the 1980s, probably in the top 5. And I hated him because he was so good at what he did. Not sure what we'll do for Monday. In fact, we won't have a show Monday. I take that back. We have Steel City Sunday on Monday. How about that? We have Steel City Sunday, pre and post game. We'll just be doing a pregame show Thank you, Maddie B. Maddie B back in the studios in Philadelphia. We work with the It's a Wrap Sports Network. I also want to mention It's a Wrap Sports. I can't put this product on the air without them. Maddie B is the guy in charge out there, and he has really helped us get a foothold into the space of the Pittsburgh Steelers. We do our live pregame show now 4 hours. So although this Monday will be 4 hours and 45 minutes of pregame, I'm working on like 14 guests. I want to have a ton of people. I've already got a guy for our Consigs Pick segment. Rob Pizzoli is a professional gambler out of Toronto. He's a great follow. He's going to be on this week, working on some other people. We have all of our usual suspects. Paul Zeiss, Todd Haley, the coach, joins us, our NFL insider, Zig Fracassi. But we can't do this without It's a Wrap Sports. And Maddie B, if you want to throw up something for It's a Wrap, please do so. Great group of people, tons of Philadelphia content. They have a Happy Valley show. They have a Penn State show as well. But they've got a ton of shows. If you're a Flyers fan, Eagles fan, Phillies fan, I'm not sure why you would be. I'm just kidding. But if you're a fan of those people, go check out It's a Wrap Sports. You can also check them out on X. I would be remiss if I did not mention that, but if you can go to It's a Wrap Sports on X and go follow them, they help us get on the air every single time we do a show. And so next Tuesday, we will have just one edition of Pittsburgh Sports Tonight. It'll be next Tuesday. I hope to announce those guests. There's the lineup for It's a Wrap Sports. Please go check out those shows. They do morning shows. They do soccer shows. You name it. That entire group of guys out there works hard to put together good content and programming. And we appreciate Matty B helping us out. He's been hanging out backstage helping me tonight. This is the first time I've actually tried to run a podcast on my own. It's really a live show, but it's archived on our YouTube channel. You can go check us out on all the social media sites at Steel City Sunday. Our shows are archived on YouTube, Facebook. They're actually archived on YouTube, but we broadcast live on X and Facebook as well. All right. I want to say goodnight to everybody. Thanks for for tuning in. Mike Lauro, thanks for checking in. We appreciate your comments. Skin tight jeans. We respect our opinion. Don't hear this side off. And very true. You need to be able to show both sides of a story. Ethan, thanks for hanging out as well this evening. And Michael Turek, thank you. We appreciate you all coming on board and watching our show this evening. Until next Tuesday, and then again Monday, Steel City Sunday, 3:30 p.m. pregame for the Steelers and Miami Dolphins. 3:30 p.m. pregame show will take you right up till about 8 o'clock on Monday. And then Tuesday from 7 to 8, it'll be Pittsburgh Sports Tonight. For the entire crew, I'm John Phillips. Thanks for joining us this evening. Thanks to John Ziegler as well. You've been watching Pittsburgh Sports Tonight right here on the It's a Wrap Sports Network.